morning and welcome to today's webcast. This is a webcast for SQL Compliance Manager, which is IDERA's auditing and compliance tool. I see some people are rolling in, so I'll try to go slow here. If you take a look at your GoToWebinar control panel, there should be a section for questions. If anytime throughout this presentation you have any questions, please enter those questions into that section. I will try to keep my eye out for that section and answer any questions as I see them come in. If I don't happen to get to them right away, there will be plenty of time for me to answer any questions that you may have at the end of the webcast. Now, this webcast typically doesn't take very long. It's not as large as of a tool as you would see some of our other products, such as IDERA SQL Diagnostic Manager. So I should be able to get through all of this within an hour, or the majority of the highlights of it. Again, this is a auditing and compliance tool. This is intended to basically audit the activities happening on your SQL Server environment, and specifically it's your Microsoft SQL Server environment. It tracks what users are doing, what application they're using to do it with, what connections they're coming from, for example, the host that the connection originated from. So it's a very good tool if you're trying to keep track of what users are doing and how they're doing and what they are doing and when they are doing it. Now, in this presentation, I typically have a few slides to go over, just kind of introduce you to the product, talk about how we designed it, talk about its architecture, some of the benefits of the tool. And then once I'm through with those slides, I will go through and actually provide a demonstration of the tool. Again, if you have any questions, please do ask those questions in the questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. This session is recorded. You'll be able to find it on our website at a later date once we finally get it uploaded. But again, we will upload it. If you have to jump out early for whatever reason, you can watch a recording. Another option would be to join another webcast of this very same topic. We do have these webinars fairly regularly, and so if you have to step out, don't worry, we do have these recorded and we do have these webinars a number of times. Without further ado, let me go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, it is an auditing tool, and when we originally designed this tool, we worked with some auditors as well as some DBAs to try to figure out what they would be looking for from an auditing tool. We worked closely with Ernst & Young, as you can see here, to find out what the auditors want. And the auditors are typically wanting something that's continuous compliance. Basically, we're always auditing the SQL Server instance. The data that we store can be trusted. We do audit ourselves to make sure that the data hasn't been tampered with. And we also provide reports that you can run. Most of the built-in reports are going to be designed to provide the information that auditors are typically looking for. The nice thing about this as well is that you can deploy the reports to SSRS, and so if you want to customize reports, you can do them from there as well. Given that you can also deploy them to SSRS, another added benefit of having it in SSRS is that if you need these reports to be generated on a scheduled basis, you can do so through subscription in SSRS. For DBAs, when they are deploying this into their environment, some of the concerns there are going to be is making sure that it's easy to deploy. You don't have to keep up a lot of maintenance on it. Basically, it's not another set of things that they have to keep their eye on in terms of monitoring their SQL servers. We also have a low overhead, and you can see here that generally it's around less than 5% on the instance that you're going to be auditing. So there will be some overhead just simply because you can't really observe something without affecting it somehow. But our again, overhead is fairly low. And of course, we do have some alerts that are built into the tool. So if we detected somebody, for example, ran a backup, we can raise an alert, or if somebody failed to log in too many times, an alert can be raised too. And that's just a few exceptions. There's a number of different ways. And the nice thing about this is that you can really truly customize it to what your needs are. And I'll try to give a demonstration to that when we get to the demo. This slide talks about the architecture of the tool. There are some moving parts to it. And when I say moving parts, I just mean different components. I like to start off on the left-hand side here. We have the SQL Compliance Manager desktop console, the SQL Compliance Manager web console, and the reports that I mentioned that can be deployed to SSRS. The web console and the reports in SSRS, those are completely optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but they are available if you decide to use them. For the most part, what I see people typically sticking to is the Compliance Manager desktop console. Whichever UI you choose to go with, they all communicate with the compliance collection service and the repository database. Now, one key thing I always want to point out about compliance manager when I talk about it, especially the architecture, is that the collection service and the repository database, they have to be on the same machine. And that's just one of the core requirements of the product. The collection service is responsible for processing the audit data that we receive from the compliance agent. When it processes the audit data, it inserts the data into the repository. It raises alerts as necessary. And it's also responsible for passing off the data to the desktop console as well. The audit data itself comes from the SQL compliance agent. And this agent is essentially a Windows service that we installed on each machine that hosts a SQL Server instance that you are trying to audit. We support, I believe, 2000 all the way to 2019. If you're in the cloud, we have limited support in the cloud. The general rule of thumb is that as long as it's a VM in the cloud, we would be able to support it, because as long as it's a VM, we would then be allowed or have the ability to install our agent. But if you're, for example, running Azure SQL database, we currently do not support that, simply because we can't install a service. If you are in the cloud and you're interested in Compliance Manager, I will say that we do have plans to support those environments, but we're just not there yet. So, again, if you're in the cloud and you're using database as a service or something like that, keep IDERA on your radar, because we may be coming out with an update and support for that soon. So again, the agent is responsible for collecting the audit data from the audited instance. What it does is that it basically grabs the files, and then at a certain interval, it sends it to the collection service. The collection service then processes the data, inserts into the repository database, and raises and generates alerts if necessary. These port requirements on the right-hand side here, I talk about the dashboard. The IDERA dashboard is simply a separate program that we installed, but it's required if you are interested in using the web console. And so that's why I have this ports information here. And Compliance Manager just use these two ports, generally speaking. For the most part, that's pretty much all I have to go over in terms of the slides. Give me 1 second here. So there's a question here about whether we support AWS clusters. I believe we do. I don't know right off the top of my head if we support multi-subnets, but I believe we do. That's something I'll have to go back and confirm with our development team, but unfortunately, I don't have that information right off hand. But but again, I believe we do. So I was moving on to the demo, sorry. So what we're looking at right now is the SQL Compliance Manager desktop console. What you'll see, this is essentially what you'll see when you launch it, and you have some servers registered. And you can see I have 2 servers registered here, the Keynote server and the lead server. Now, as I mentioned in my previous slide, we do support a number of versions of SQL Server. 2022 is not supported as of yet. We will be adding support of it. It just, after the release of it, it takes us some time to actually include support of the latest version of SQL Server. But we do expand support to the latest version. It just, again, takes some time for us to begin to officially support it. Sorry about that. So these are the instances that I have registered. If you expand them, you'll be able to see the databases that I have registered for auditing. Now, my first server, you can see it has this little red X over in it, and that's because I've disabled auditing for that instance. And the reason why I disable auditing for that instance is because I've actually have it turned off currently, and I didn't want to see any errors for it. So that's the reason why it's disabled. This lead server, on the other hand, it is not disabled, and therefore you don't see that red icon there. And you can see that I am auditing 2 different databases on that instance. Now, just to be clear, I have more than just 2 databases on that system. And just so I show you in my SQL Server Management Studio, I have a number of databases here. But I am only interested in auditing this tool. Now, when you first launch it, you're obviously not going to have any servers registered. To register servers can be fairly easy. You can click this new button and click registered SQL server, and it opens up a wizard and walks you through the whole process. The nice thing about it is that it is a wizard. It walks you through the whole process. I wish I had some servers to add here for you to see the process, but it's fairly simple. What you do is you give it the name. I can't do it because there are some certain checks that it does in this wizard that it's gonna basically hang while it tries to go connect to the instance. Since I don't have an instance available, I can't use a fake name. But what it essentially does is that you type in a name of an instance, it tries to make some initial connections to check the versions of the SQL Server SQL Server instance. Then it proceeds to ask for a user account so that we can install our service. Ask you which audit settings you want, which databases you want to audit, and then it goes on, does this process to install the agent and set up auditing. Now, once that's all done, you'll see the server listed here as well as the databases. Now, in terms of your audit settings, you can go with some of the defaults, which is very minimal. You can choose some regulation guidelines, which are basically preset audit configuration settings that allow you to comply with certain regulations that are out there. And just kind of show you, you can't set these regulations after, or you can change your audit settings afterwards. So you don't feel too pressured that you have to have all that information of which settings you need right away. You can reconfigure it later. And just as an example, if I wanted to apply a regulation guideline, what I could do is right click on the monitored instance, and there's an option here that says apply regulation guideline. And when you select that option, it actually opens up another wizard. Basically allows you to select which regulation guideline or guidelines you want to comply with. And you can see here we have a number of them that are built in. So if you need to comply with CIS, PCI, SOX, HIPAA, GDPR, we have some of these already built in. And so if I want to comply with GDPR, I can just select that option. Or if I also wanted SOX compliance, I could select that option as well. And it just pre-selects the options that you have to have enabled. And it walks you through the process of configuring them. Turn on any additional options if you want. you can see it turns on quite a bit depending on the regulate guideline that you're trying to comply with. And once you're set, you figure out which tables and databases you want to audit. It goes through some checks. And if you want to apply them, you can click finish here. But in my case, I'm not interested in applying with those guidelines, so I'm going to click cancel. But again, you know, the wizard walks you through the entire process. Now, if you want to configure your audit settings manually, you'll have to remember that there are two levels of configurations. There's going to be a level at the server and a level at the database. This allows you to have different audit settings for each database that you're trying to audit, because you know some databases you may want to audit more closely than others, and so it gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you configure auditing. To view the settings, you just have to view the properties of the either instance or the database. So here is the instance level properties, and on the audit activities tab, you can see here that I am just auditing failed logins, any security changes, administrative actions, or database definitions, DDL. So we're going to be tracking these things at the instance level. And just to kind of also clarify, we have these two different levels simply because certain things happen at the database level, certain things happen at the instance level. So for example, when you're logging in, you're being authenticated through the instance, not the database. You may get redirected to the database, but you're still being authenticated through the instance. And so that's another reason why we have these different levels. And I point that out because when we look at the database properties later, you'll also see like admin and DDL and even security changes. But those, again, are going to be different than what you set over here. These are some options in terms of how you want to collect the data. So you do have options in terms of whether you use profiler trace, whether you want to use extended events, or if you want to use SQL Server Audit. Now, just to be clear, this does not apply to everything. So if I decided to say I wanted to collect using extended events, this only applies to DML and select activities. Any of these logins, logouts, security changes, administrative, that's still going to be tracked through SQL profiler trace, sorry. So I just want to point that out there. We do have different options in terms of what you gather certain data with. Trusted users, if you have certain accounts that you know are accessing your SQL Server environment constantly or very regularly, and it's an account that you trust and you don't feel like you need to have to audit, this is what trusted users for. It's kind of setting exclusions for things you don't want to capture for certain users. I typically say that these are great for service accounts that are typically accessing and doing a lot of work on your SQL Server instance, simply because if you're trying to capture everything the service account is doing, you may end up gathering a lot of transactions that you might not necessarily want to keep on hand. That can basically bloat the data that you're collecting. And so if you have the capability of excluding some users, do that using trusted users. Our privileged user auditing, in some cases, you may want to audit certain users with different settings. And that's what this privileged user auditing is intended for. Just to kind of give you an example, let's see, for most of our users, I want to know whenever the logins fail or they're making security changes or admins. Maybe not security changes, because most of my users might not have security ability to change securities. But let's say for my privileged users, that like my sysadmins, for example, they may have a little bit more power. So I may come in here and say, you know what, this is my sysadmin that I want to audit a little bit closer. And I do want to know when they're making security changes, because things like that is something I would need to know. I would also like to know whenever they're logging in, because maybe these guys shouldn't be logging into my SQL Server instance very often. And if they are logging in, I like to know about it. And so I'll be tracking their logins. And for some reason, maybe I need to capture the SQL statements of whenever they're performing a DML or select, because maybe they're altering my database for some reason, and I need to keep a closer eye on what they're doing. So again, this you don't have to. they don't have to be a sysadmin or anything like that, but that's just an example I like to use because those users typically have a little bit more power than other people, and so you want to typically keep a closer eye on them in terms of what they're doing on the system. And that's the intention of what privileged user, just to have different audit settings configured. These auditing thresholds, these options basically tie back to the server activity report card that you see in the background. As you can see here, I don't have any of them enabled currently, but if I turn them on, let me go ahead and do that just so you can kind of see. What this does is that it ties back to the graph. And so the idea is that here it says in the past hour, if I have logins, for example, that's more than 100 logins but less than 150, it would be a warning state. And if I have over 150 logins within an hour, then it'd be critical. And what it does that it ties back to this graph here. And you can see here that, oh, I have a lot of logins. That's why I'm in a critical state now. I have a lot of logouts also. That's why it's in a critical state here. And that's what, again, it ties back to the graph. And it's a way of allowing you to get a quick glimpse of trying to see things are abnormal for your environment, for example. I'm sorry, there's a question here. So I think the question here is asking whether a login can occur from an unusual IP. Now, SQL Compliance Manager, let's say, it doesn't have any artificial intelligence in it. So it's not going to be able to track, oh, you know what, this login is typically coming from this location. Now all of a sudden it's coming from here. Raise an alert. Unfortunately, it doesn't have that kind of AI built into it. What it does have, for example, let me try to show you here. Let me find an event to kind of give you an example. So I'm gonna go audit events, and since we're talking about logins, I'm looking for a login event here. You will have to be a little patient with me. My machine's a little bit slow just because I have a few VMs running on my laptop concurrently, and so it is a little low on resources, so it does take a little time for the screen to load. But if you be patient with me, that'll be helpful. So this is the kind of information that you would see in terms of a login event. So you can see what the login user account is, what they logged into, and what application they used. Now, if you go to the details tab, you find a little bit more information. So you can see, again, the host name. So this is where I guess the machine name from which the connection originated from. That's in a sense as detailed as we can get in terms of which machine the login came from. So unfortunately, we don't track the IP address. But what you can do is that if you know a certain login comes from, this certain login, for example, always comes from this machine, what you can do is that you can go over to administration and create some alert rules. So for example, if using that same example, a login coming from a different machine, for example, you could use login activity, or you could be very specific, or you could say, the category is login, and rather than it including logouts or failed logins, you could just say login. And what you could say here is that the host name is except Lee, so because the Lee is the one that it's usually coming from. So this is create an alert for whenever a login comes from any host name that's not Lee, and the login name is the one that I was looking at. And so the way this reads is that basically raise an alert whenever the login comes from any host that is not Lee, but the login name is so-and-so. Now, when you define these things, you can use wildcards just so that you know. So you can use, I believe, we use star in this application. So this can apply to just about any account in that domain. But obviously that's a little bit too broad. I just wanted to let you know that we can use wildcards here. But you could set up a rule like this, and that way you can be alerted whenever a login comes from a different host that's not expected. That's also a very good way of determining that whether a certain account has been breached or not, because if an account's only supposed to be used on a certain machine, you can set up these alert rules for that. But that was a very good question. Going back, so I showed you, just because I got sidetracked, I did show you how to look at the details of a specific event. The summary screen here shows you the last, I believe, like few hundred recent events on that specific instance. Even it shows you some of your audit settings. It shows you the status of the server. If you select a specific database, we obviously filter down to that specific database. You can see here, this graph is pretty empty because there's no activity being captured, but right here, I have a little bit more activity, and so you see more. Now, earlier I talked about the instance level audit settings. Sorry, I'm skipping around here, but let me go ahead and show you the database level settings. And so the audit activities, you can see here that settings are a little bit different. Some of them look the same: security, administration, DDL. But again, these are going to be the DDL or admin or security changes that happen at the database level. So if, for example, you grant someone permissions to a specific database, that was security changes here, not at the instance level. If you grant a login access to SQL Server, then that you'll find that security change in the instance. So they're very small differences, but they are there, and so you kind of have to be aware of it when configuring auditing. The one thing that, two things that you would find here that you didn't see at the instance level is going to be the DML and select operation. So here you can see that I am collecting DML option, DML activities. So anything inserts, deletes, delete, updates, execution of stored procedures, that all falls into the DML. I'm not capturing selects just because selects can typically generate a lot of information, but if you are required to capture select activity, you can turn it on here. If your databases have like sensitive information such as credit card information, people's addresses, social security numbers, things of any kind of sensitive information you want to keep track of whenever users access it, you can turn on sensitive column auditing. This is exactly what that's designed for. So anytime somebody selects data from a sensitive column, we will be able to track it, and we actually mark the activity as sensitive column access. The other option, of course, is just to turn on select auditing here. But again, this can gather more data. Sensitive columns is a little bit more finer tuned so that you can just focus on capturing selects on those specific columns. If you want to filter out certain things, you could use this DML select filter as well. By default, it's going to select all database objects. But I will point out that if you do filter it, this applies to both DML and select if you have it turned on here. There's not one way you can filter for DMLs and one filter for selects. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We focus on the same user tables if you use this option here. The before and after data is a really neat feature. What this does is that it tracks how your data is changing over a period of time. So if, for example, you want to keep track of whenever a user updates a specific table or a specific column, this is what this feature does. And just kind of give you an example. So earlier, before I set this up, I ran this query right here, basically just to update my customers table to change the contact name for the specific contact ID. And Compliance Manager did pick it up. You can see here, this is the first one. And it captured the SQL the query text. But right here, you can actually see the before and after data. And so before the change was made, before the update, the value was tapped. After the update, the value became John Doe, as you can see here in the query. It's setting it to John Doe. And so this is a really neat feature because again, it tracks changes that's happening to your SQL Server instance or to your tables or data. Let me show you this other tab, this Audit Event Tab. This Audit Event Tab is nice because it has some filters. So if you're looking for a specific type event type, you can find it here. But the reason why I want to show you this is because if you expand this, you can also see how the data is changing this way. So it tells you which key was changed, what value, and how it changed. And same thing here. So you change from John Doe back to tab. And, yeah, I have this job that runs over and over. That changes. It just pretty much causes blocking. So I could demonstrate another tool, but it constantly updates those tables. But that's an example of the before and after data. Going back to the properties, I talked about sensitive column, trusted users and privileged users, the same principles that are defined at the instance level, so I won't talk about these here. So that at a high level talks about how you can configure auditing. You can either use regulation guidelines or you can configure your own audit settings. If you configure your own audit settings, do keep in mind that you can have different settings for each database that you audit. I talked about how you can view the details of an event. You just double click on the thing and you'll see the details in here. Let me think. We also have on the instance level, if you select it, you'll notice that there are event alerts and data alerts. These pertain to the audit alert rules that you configured. You can see here that I have a few roles configured already. For example, I have this backup role. So in my environment, I use SQL Safe to perform my backups. And I only want SQL Safe to perform the backups because that way it doesn't throw some of my LSNs out of whack and ruin some of my log shipping policies, for example. And so for that reason, I always want to know if a backup is performed through some other tool that's not SQL Safe. And so that's what this rule here is. It says basically generate an alert whenever a backup happens and the application is not SQL Safe, and it sends an email to myself. If I go back here, you can see that a backup was performed through Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, and so an alert was raised for me. So not only does it send an email to myself, but it also logs the alert. So that way, if I need to come back and see what alerts were raised in the past, I can come here. This data alerts, this pertains to sensitive column access. I didn't have sensitive columns configured, and so that's why this is empty. But you can configure sensitive data alert rules, and so using this data button. When you create an event rule, this is really neat because you basically tell us what kind of events you want to be alerted on. You can go something very general, like security changes, admin, some of these other options here, or you could be very specific. I like being specific so that way you don't get a lot of noise, you can say. Because so for example, if you go with security changes, you can see that there are a lot of different types in here. And so I don't like to use those general radio buttons. I'd rather be very specific, that way I'm not getting alerted on everything. But again, this is depending on what your use case is. Maybe you do want to be alert on everything. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry about that, I had the cough. But maybe you do want to be alert on all of these things, and using those general buttons is sufficient. But in my case, I like to use a little bit more specific. On the next page, this is where you start adding whether you want to apply certain roles or additional checks, conditions to the alert. So if you want this to be for a specific SQL Server instance, you can do so. So maybe I want to apply this to my lead instance only. If I wanted to apply to a certain application name, login name, whatever the case may be. And the way, when I create these alert roles, what I like to do is like, I like to look at the details of the specific event that I'm trying to be alerted upon. So I go to Audit Events, I open up the details, and so I look at all of this information here just so that I can create the event role based off of this information here so that I don't get, I guess you can say, false notifications for something I'm not interested in. But that, in generally speaking, is creating alert roles. You can create event filters. Event filters are for defining exclusions for things that you don't want Compliance Manager to capture. So for example, here on this particular database, I'm filtering all select events where the login name is so-and-so, my administrator account. Maybe I want to capture selects for everybody else, but my administrator account, I don't care for. So this is what you can create. You can create filters saying, hey, exclude these type of events for certain user, certain database. When you configure it, it's going to be very similar to like the conditions that you set when creating event filters. You do have options in here to go and define what have you. SQL Logins, this pertains to access to the SQL compliance data. You see here, you can define whether some people only have access to view and run the data, yes, or some people actually have the ability to come in and configure settings, basically kind of like admin permissions inside of the tool itself. I would note that this does audit or update the permissions at your SQL Server instance level. So do kind of be careful with configuring settings through here. Activity log, this tracks all the activity that's happening within SQL Compliance Manager. If it starts running to errors, things are okay, this is where you'll find it. Change log, this is where people, if you made some settings changes, you change your audit settings, you added servers, you added databases for auditing, you'll find all of that stuff in here. This tracks the activities that's happening within the tool itself. Default audit settings, this is where you can configure your defaults. If you've used Compliance Manager before and you know exactly what audit settings you want to use for each database and each instance, you can come in here and define those settings here. That way, whenever you add a new instance or a new database for auditing, you can just say, use the defaults, and it'll apply whatever default settings you apply here. That way, you don't have to go back afterwards and add those settings back in. The tool will allow you to do it automatically. Audit reports. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a number of reports that are included by default. Most of these reports will pretty much apply to anything auditor or provide the information that any auditor would most likely like to see. So for example, I like to use the object activity report as my examples. You can select it, you can see there are quite a bit of filters here. If I want to be for a specific instance or a specific database, I can do it here. I'm gonna just say stars just to show you everything, specify the date. If you want to see the T-SQL, you can say yes. Privileged users only, say false, because I want to see everybody and all categories. I'm gonna just leave everything else the same as a default and run the report. The nice thing about this is that these reports, once you run them, they can be exported to an Excel file, for example. So if you need to manipulate the data even further, you could do so through Excel. Now I'm over here, sorry, I'm waiting for this to run, but while this is running, I'm looking at some of the questions here. One of the questions are there any guidelines or documentation on performance consideration? That I unfortunately do not have any documentations of. I do know we do have a wiki which shows you what all of the audit settings are. Some of my recommendations typically depends on the number of databases on the system, the number of databases you're actually auditing versus what's on the system, maybe even privileged user settings. What I will say is that obviously the more auditing options you enable, the heavier the impact it will have on performance. Um, so if you're trying to keep it very minimal, then you'll want to define, for example, as much trusted users as possible or enable as few options as possible. Can we create a generic event alert type to use for a number of databases across many instances? Yes, you can. So before I get to that answer, let me talk about this report. So here the report's generated. You can see the output of it. You can see it provides quite a bit of information here. And um, yeah, the target database, the schema, target object, quite a bit of information. And as I mentioned earlier, you can't export this. So you click on the save button, you can export Excel or PDF. If you export Excel, the nice thing about it is that if you need to manipulate or reorganize the data even further for whatever reason, you can do it through Excel. These reports can be deployed to SSRS, and the wizard for it is fairly simple. You just tell us where your server is and what have you. I do have it already deployed, and so let me kind of quickly show you. Sign in here. And so when we log in here, you're going to see that I have a few reports for a few different products here, but we do have, I do have a folder that's specific to SQL Compliance Manager. And in there's going to be broken out to like whether it's like today, I forget what the other options are, last 30 days maybe. But once you drop into those folders, you'll see the exact same reports that you see on the console. So let's see, Compliance Manager reports. So I'm gonna just go anytime, and you'll see the exact same reports that you would see here. There you go. Now, going back to the question about creating a generic alert. If you want a very generic alert, what you could do is that, you know, select one of these generic options here. And if you want it to apply to every single server instance, then just don't check that. If you want it to apply to every database, then just don't check that. And you can see here if it reads, it creates a medium alert for security events in general on any SQL Server instance, and there's no database filter, what have you. So yes, you can create generic events, alert types. Is the retention history configurable? So yes. So I didn't even talk about the retention. By default, if you install Compliance Manager, it's going to keep all the data that it collects indefinitely until you actually go in and delete the data manually. If you go to auditing and archive and retention, and go to archive preferences, this is where you can come in and configure how much data we should keep. In my environment, I went ahead and configured this so that I only keep 30 days, last 30 days. Anything older than 30 days gets moved into an archive database. And the archive database is going to be one created for each quarter of the year. Yeah, I think it's better if I just show you. So if I go here to SQL Server Management Studio, you can see that I have a number of compliance databases, starting from this all the way down to this. SQL Compliance and SQL Compliance Processing are system databases. My active audit data is stored in these. You see it's SQL Compliance _ the instance name. My archive data are going to be the ones up here, where's the SQL CM archive. And so what happens is that every time my archive runs, it goes and looks for any data that's older than 30 days. If it finds any, then it moves it into the appropriate archive database. And the idea here is that, let's say, once all the data has been archived to the appropriate archive database, what you would do is back up that database and drop it. Now, I want to say that all the data. So Q2 for 2021, that was several months ago. All the data that's in that quarter should have been archived already, and then this is when it's safe to go ahead and back it up, and you could detach or drop the database and keep the backup, for example. You don't want to do that while the quarter's not completed yet, and the reason why I say that is because if you drop the database before the archives are completing, moving the quarterly data in there, what it would end up happening is when the archive runs again, it's going to create a new database. And so now you have two different databases that are for the same month, but the data is not all in the same backup, if that follows. But you can, short story is that you can configure your retention manually. And again, it's not configured by default. So this other user says that they're constantly running space issues using this data. This tool can gather quite a bit of data, especially if you're a very busy server. That's one of the things you want to do to combat that is, check your audit settings. Make sure that you're not capturing too much data. If there are certain things that you can exclude, try to exclude those. Other things that you can do is, again, look at your audit settings. Sometimes you may be auditing certain settings more than once, and that can also bloat up how much data you're capturing. But if you're a user of this tool and you're still struggling with the space issues, I would recommend contacting support, and we'll be able to help you from that point forward. Is this tool bundled with other IDERA tools? Yes. I know for sure that we include this in our security suite. The security suite comprises of SQL Compliance Manager as well as SQL Secure. It's SQL Secure, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a tool that goes out and checks users' permissions to databases, to the SQL Server instance, and it gives you a general report on what they have access to and which database objects, things like that, or even if, for example, if they were given access to a SQL Server instance through a security group, it'll tell you which security group. It's a really good tool because the reason why we put it in a suite together is that the idea is that you would use security suite to kind of like go through everybody's permissions and then run the report, find out who has access to what, then you tighten down your permissions, and then you implement SQL Compliance Manager to make sure that those guys are sticking to what they're allowed to do, and that's overstepping their bounds. But yes, I believe their Compliance Manager is also included in one or maybe two other suites, but I don't know what they are off the top of my head. I do know that Security Suite is one, but off the top of my head. What alerts are supported? So when you configure your alert rules, we do support emails, which I mentioned earlier. But the other things that we support is writing it to the event log. Here, let me look at one that I've configured already. Writing to the event log or an SMP trap. SNMP trap. So these are the things that we would be able to support. What I've seen people use is this if they're trying to pass the information to a different third-party application. I personally am not very familiar with how to use it, but I've seen people use this for things such as I can't remember, ServiceNow, and that's yeah, I've seen people use that for ServiceNow. How do we back up Compliance Manager? So in terms of basically your settings, the data that we've captured, it would be simply to back up these databases here. This contains everything for Compliance Manager. For example, your audit settings, how you configure things, you'll find that over here. Compliance processing, that's just used for whenever we process the audit data. But for the most part, other than that, you're going to look at this is what we call the event database, the ones that contains the audit data for your specific audit instance. We call the event databases because it contains all the events happening on the instance. These are your archives, and this is the system database. So if you want to back up everything, then you'll just back up the databases. If you're just interested in backing up the old data that you've gathered, you back up these archives. I hope that answers the questions you're asking. Now we're getting very close to the end of the time, so I'm gonna try to wrap things up here. Compliance Manager, if you are interested, it is an auditing tool, captures the audit data. Again, allows you to configure things at a database level. In terms of licenses and how we charge, it is licensed by per instance, and that's per instance that you're auditing. If your data instance is disabled, like I have here, it is still counting towards your license, just because you have it registered and you can re-enable license auditing at any given point. But if you've previously audited instance and you're no longer interested in auditing it, you can actually right-click on it and remove the instance. It'll ask you, do you want to remove it? You say yes. It'll ask you, do you want to keep the data, the previous data? And in this case, I'm gonna say yes, because I'm gonna re-add the instance later. But the point that I wanted to make here is that you can remove the instance and you can still report off of the old data in the archive databases. I still have the archive databases still attached here and in Compliance Manager. And as long as they're still attached in Compliance Manager, you'll still be able to run reports from it. You'll be able to use the console to view the archive events. And so you still have access to the old archive data, but it's not counting to your towards the license consumption anymore. And again, it is licensed per instance. So if you have 3 instances running on one particular server, that's still 3 different instances. This is complaining it can't reach my server because my server's turned off. But ask if I want to go ahead and remove it, and I do. Now, if you are interested in learning or using the tool, you can download this from our website. It's www.idera.com. As you can see here, www.idera.com. It comes with a 14-day trial, and I believe you're able to audit up to 10 or 15 instances for those 14 days. And I'm sure if you take a look at it, you'll be impressed on how much data it can actually capture. I want to thank everybody for joining today's webinar. I hope you found this very informative. If again, this webcast will be uploaded at a later date, so if you want to get back to the recording of it, please check our website again. Again, thank you, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Give me one more second. Per instance, any number of databases. Yes, so in terms of licenses, it is per instance. We don't care how many databases are on that instance. We are just per instance. Do IDERA customers get a discount on Compliance Manager? You will, if you're looking for discounts, you'll have to talk to your account manager. I unfortunately am not able to assist in that area. But again, okay, thank you everybody. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Bye.